Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining today's CPD accredited webinar, Navigating the Evolving International Sanctions Landscape, Preparing for 2025 and Beyond. As sanctions continue to evolve, driven by shifting alliances, geopolitical tensions, and heightened regulatory scrutiny, it's never been more important for financial institutions to stay ahead. This session is here to help you do just that. We're joined by four outstanding speakers who bring a wealth of experience from both the public and private sectors. Chloe Sina, international sanctions expert and former UK head of sanctions at HSBC. Latte Penny, group sanctions specialist at Standard Chartered Bank. Emily Diaz, APAC sanctions compliance officer at Morgan Stanley. And Freya Page, director at Karen and founding member of the UK's OFSI. They'll be sharing more about their backgrounds in just a moment, and I would like to remind you all that all views shared today are those of the individual and do not reflect the organizations. If time permits at the end, we'll be holding a Q&A, so please feel free to drop your questions into the chat box at any time throughout the session, and they'll be answered in the order they're received. With that, let's get started as I pass it off to Chloe and Freya.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of those that have attended today around the world. I know for some it's late and some it's early, and for us it's a little bit of a mixed bag. You've got a really global panel today. So we're going to start really with an update as to where we are now with sanctions. But I did ask Aspen, our organizer, what the makeup of the delegates was today. And I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are those of you that have been working in sanctions for a long time, and those that are new and are just have signed up out of interest. So I like to make sure that everybody gets something to take away from this with. And of course, if there are any questions that you wish to ask during the course of the session, you've got an expert panel who are ready hands-on to open the chat messages. If they're able to answer it, they will do so directly, and if not, they will pass it on to one of the panelists. So please feel free to utilize our expertise and ask questions. So I could go back to Cuba, I could go back to South Africa, when sort of we had the beginnings of arms embargoes, sanctions imposed on a unilateral basis to address very particular issues under international peace and security. But actually, I always like to start with 9/11 and just sort of with a canter through, and I say canter through, I mean a couple of minutes, just to give you a flavour of how we've arrived today in 2025 with the sorts of sanctions that we've got. So everyone will recall in 9/11, we had the first type of sanctions that were being developed under Al-Qaeda in response to the tragic atrocities in New York. And we had those sanctions under the first really big terrorist UN Security Council resolution 1267. The Al-Qaeda resolution has obviously evolved, and it's Daesh, ISIL now as well, but it's still very much about addressing the threat of terrorism internationally. And then if you move swiftly on to 2006, that's when we got the Iranian non-proliferation sanctions with UN Security Council Resolution 1696. And that was very much, obviously, we've had the Iran nuclear deal agreed, and we've had it torn up, and we've got Trump now going back in to negotiate with the Iranians very much on the same terms as in 2018 when he actually tore up the Iran nuclear deal. But those sorts of sanctions were there to deal with nuclear proliferation, which was seen and still is seen as a threat to international peace and security. In 2011, we had the Arab Spring sanctions across Libya, Egypt, Syria, of course, and I think Freya and I will come to Syria shortly because that's a much more topical matter. But those were mainly to do with coercing behavioural change, so regime change, but also there was a very interesting part of the Arab Spring sanctions that was the misappropriation part, which was to preserve the assets that had been misappropriated by the regime, so the Gaddafi regime, in order to return those assets back to the people of Libya after the regime change. But how many years? 14 years later, there's still around about 100 billion sitting outside Libya because there's no stability and those assets can't be returned. We have the annexation of Crimea sanctions in 2014. those ran a shock to the market because they were new. They weren't just list-based. It was obviously in response to Putin's actions in Crimea. And it fast forwards, there's been some other types of measures since, but we get to 2022, and that's really where we saw an unprecedented wave of sanctions being introduced. And I think there's no sector that is untouched. But during that sort of 20 or so year history, within those different types of sanctions measures, which are there to deter nuclear proliferation, to coerce regime change, to preserve assets. We've seen a range of different sanctions used, from asset freezes to travel bans to restrictions on goods to bans on trade services. And it's where we are today, in a complex geopolitical landscape where we have layers upon layers of sanctions measures without actually having any convergence across the different regimes, because we've had multilateral sanctions imposed by the UN and the EU, and we've had unilateral sanctions posed by particular states, of course, America being the most aggressive. And I think that's where I'm going to pause and move on to Freya, who will give you an idea of the different regimes and global implementation. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Chloe. So Chloe's covered off a lot of the stuff that we see here on this particular slide. So why are sanctions used? You know, that they're not there to penalise anyone. They're not as a punishment. Sanctions are very much there to ensure, or to try and help change behaviour, change direction of a potential political state. So looking at it as a foreign diplomatic tool, or as a national security tool to try and change, coerce behaviour, and try and exert pressure on a particular regime as well to try and encourage that behaviour change. It's often seen as the last tool in the toolbox before boots on the ground, as it were. And we're seeing that a lot at the moment. Certainly in the last few years, we're seeing really the increase in sanctions, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go on today's webinar. But we're seeing this used an awful lot now, where sanctions are quickly becoming, and are becoming really, the go-to tool in order to really affect that. So on the next slide, if I can just talk about the sort of different types of sanctions that we have, because it's important to understand what those sanctions look like holistically. And this also helps to understand why sanctions are so complex, why we're here today, and why you're joining us for this conversation this morning. So we have the financial and economic sanctions, so things like your asset freezes, your financial restrictions that will target very specific financial markets. And these are most commonly understood and enforced, especially by the banks. Financial and economic sanctions can be tangible, it can be intangible goods, and it's also, you know, making goods available or for the benefit of a sanctioned entity, person or entity. We also have immigration sanctions, and these are usually taken in the form of a travel ban. So that they're sort of a political symbol, if you like, but they can also help to disrupt the movement of facilitators or enablers as well. We have trade sanctions. We're seeing these becoming more and more important, as some of you joining us today in the field will appreciate that the sort of emphasis on trade sanctions and actually specific goods is becoming increasingly more difficult to monitor and understand. So with these, they can ban or restrict goods and services. You can sort of limit the imports or exports of a good. And in some cases, it can prohibit entire sectors. So, for example, technology, oil and gas, such as we see with the oil price cap, or very specific military end-use goods as well. We have aircraft sanctions, or sort of transport sanctions, really as well, which can involve sort of grounding planes, removing insurance or maintenance rights, denying access to airspace. And then, of course, we have the shipping sanctions, very, very similar to aircraft sanctions, but shipping sanctions which are specifically drawn out by UK regulations, actually. So there's a whole shipping sanctions list that is not included on the consolidated list in the UK, but it is included in US and EU sanctions, but where you can sort of even designate sort of vessels, you can ban particular port stops and movement of that vessel. And the EU has even gone as far as to designate specific ports as well, which has huge implications for insurers, for traders, and also banks that are involved in the financing of, maritime logistics. So that can also pose equal issues on financial institutions as well. So yeah, you can start to see by those the layers of complexity that you have when you're looking at sanctions. You're not just looking at one type of good or one sort of sector. It really is spanning an entire ecosystem of how global and international trade really sort of works. And of course, we're seeing that enforcement practices are sort of growing as well to sort of to try and keep up with the evolution of these sanctions as well. So it's not just about who's on the list, it's also about sort of what people are trading as well. It's, and how they're trading it as well. So this is where things get a little bit complex. We often talk about sanctions as being a single system, but in reality, as Chloe alluded to start with, they very much overlap, and they sometimes conflict as well. At the international level, we have UN sanctions, and that's a really good example of multilateral sanctions, where a group of countries will come together and they will agree to take, coordinated action, usually through the UN Security Council. But today, in today's sort of fractured geopolitical environment, things are becoming less common in that sense, especially with sort of major powers often having different foreign policy and national security objectives. And then we start to see, the growth of unilateral sanctions as well. And we have those, for example, we've got a few examples here. Unilateral sanctions by the EU, by the UK. We have both OFSI and OTSI as the implementers in that. We have the US sanctions coming through OFAC, and we have lots of other countries as well. And I'll go through each of these very briefly so you can understand a bit more about them. Certainly with the EU, you have all 27 member states coming together and agreeing through the EU Commission, what those sanctions look like as a baseline for the EU. Specific member states will obviously have the ability to go a bit further than that if they want to as well. So you will start to see slight divergences within the European Union member states as well, but there will be a baseline of what those EU sanctions look like. Within the UK, sanctions are decided on with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And are implemented through various different departments. So OFSI, many of you may know already, OTSI, the new trade body, and we also have the Department for Transport, which also looks after the aviation and maritime sanctions side of things as well. The US designates and implements through OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, and of course other countries, when we have sanctions, we also see them implemented by Canada, Australia, Japan, Switzerland, and of course other counter sanctions such as China and Russia. So other states putting their own sanctions on, but back on those more sort of commonly used Western voices that are sort of, there is divergence between who is specifically designated, but usually there will be an overall theme where they are working together as well. So I think I'll hand over to Chloe, I think back next for the next slide.
Thanks very much. I think I already did this slide, but I'll tackle it again, but with some new information for you. But I think just going back to the different types of sanctions, there is, just to sort of bring stuff sort of up to date, and I think illustrate a really good example of what I would say was more the creative, novel type of sanctions and thinking that's coming out of the UK. So I think for those of you that aren't based in the UK or in France, but certainly in Europe or elsewhere, you will no doubt be familiar with the issue of migration, and we have a channel between us and France, and there's a lot of controversy about migrants coming across the channel into the UK, and I think the whole of Europe is facing similar issues. But one way that this has been dealt with recently by the Foreign Office is to introduce the organised migration sanctions, and they are directed, they're very novel, so they're not about punishing the migrants themselves, but it's very much about tackling the organised criminals, the smuggling networks, and sort of breaking down, disrupting those networks, freezing their assets, prohibiting them from travelling. That's the sort of latest stuff that we've had coming out of the UK, and very interesting. I think when I look at this slide, I obviously touched upon the different types of sanctions. We've done a lot of talking about Russia in the past, and I think probably anybody that's interested has followed for the last 3 years that we had, the ratcheting up of a phenomenal number of different types of measures that every sector, even, from pharma to commodities to, defense, etc., has been touched by. Architectural tax specialists have had to actually get their head around these sanctions, because the aim has been to really draw on all of the different areas that could actually disrupt and deter the regime from continuing of waging war on Ukraine. Of course, that war continues. But I think the most interesting of these at the moment is Syria, because Syria we are seeing now for the first time, and I think most recently the EU is indicating that it is going to be in lockstep with the US. The first time we're going to really see the dismantling of a comprehensive sanctions regime, where the US is going first in terms of actual comprehensive dismantling of that regime, but also, there's been a sort of partial lifting of sanctions since the regime fell in December by the EU and the UK. And so if we go back to the Arab Spring, the point I mentioned earlier, it was a slow ratcheting up of sanctions against Syria, over a 3-4 year period before the atrocities of Assad in terms of repressing the civilian population got to the point where, they were barrel bombing civilians with chemical weapons. Up till about 2015, it was incremental, but then it became a comprehensive regime. And here now we're faced with this dismantling objective, which we haven't really done in terms of breaking down that architecture before. And it's a real challenge, because it's not overnight that you can actually take off one particular measure or take off all of the measures and expect business as usual. Because just think of banking. The main sanctions in 2015 on the banking sector was about a prohibition on the opening of new correspondent bank accounts. And so for those that were in place in border countries, Jordan, Lebanon, etc., they could continue, although there was a primary sanctions risk if there was a nexus to the US dollar or the pound or the euro. But there are very few correspondents, and setting up a correspondent banking relationship is huge. It takes a great deal of effort. Imagine the due diligence that has to go into that. There have to be correspondents in the entire network that are prepared to take that step, that brave step forward. And of course, there are banks in the region that have continued to maintain a sort of partial relationship with the Syrian banks. But it will not be easy to dismantle that regime and actually achieve a situation where Syria has an economy that can run in exactly the same way as those elsewhere in that region. And I think there is an expectation that it will be overnight. And the tragedy is that irrespective of the will of the international community, the political will and the people, both in Syria and outside, never mind the conditions that need to be set, that need to be met to ensure that the dismantling of sanctions is correct at this stage. Never mind all of that. It's actually the businesses, the foreign direct investment that can make that change. So the people of Syria will only see that change over a very long, prolonged period of time. I mean, it will be positive, of course, one hopes, but it will not be overnight. And I think we know that because of what happened in Iran. So in 2016, there'd been partial lifting of some Iranian sanctions on gold and precious metals between 2014 and 2016 to test what it looked like and how it is possible, whether it's possible to sort of navigate through those changes. And then, of course, in 2016, we saw widespread lifting of the Iranian sanctions. Obviously, only the secondary sanctions on the US side, which was the crux of the issue for the nuclear deal being upheld. But we saw very few businesses going back into Iran. And the reason for that is, if you've had your fingers burnt, if you've been told and you've had enforcement action as a bank, I always think of BNP, 8.9 billion, but there are so many others, 1.9 billion for HSBC. If you've had those prosecutions, those cease and desist orders, and you've been punished, there's very little appetite to go back into that sort of high risk area. And without finance, you can't achieve your aims, because even if you're a small corporate selling something anodyne like juice or pens for children, you cannot do that unless you've got the financing. And that's the real challenge. And that's, I think, what we're going to face with Syria. But the great thing about Syria is at the moment, there seems to be an international community that is supportive, and a population that has been depleted and repressed for so long that the moral compass of everybody, I think, is going in the right direction. So over to you, Freya.
Thanks, Chloe. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, just to pick up a couple of things on the Syria point. I think it's a good reminder for us all, really, that sanctions are not static. And I think it's, as you mentioned, it's the first time a major regime is being sort of broken down. But we often focus on enforcement and new listings and new measures, but actually, it's delistings are also important, and how we what are the outcome of the sanctions regimes. We see them imposed, but actually, breaking them down and actually lifting them is a really, really important part of the process, and how we manage that. And it gives us new challenges as well. When you look at individuals being removed, you want to align with current foreign policy. As you mentioned, Chloe, with Iran, it was, people were sort of being encouraged to do business again, but how do you do that? You don't want to be burnt again. So it's really important to sort of, understand that sort of broader risk environment. And again, it's another part of ensuring that, your screening and transaction monitoring processes are up to date, because as these things start to peel away, you want to make sure that your systems are robust enough to ensure that you are continuing to monitor, and you have that all in place to prevent any non-compliance issues. But yeah, a really important part actually on this, and I think it's a really good time to kind of think about this, as well as we see Russia getting more complex, and we're starting to see potential sort of talks around ceasefire and what that could mean for other complex sanctions potentially being lifted in future. So Syria is a good one that we can start to sort of cut our teeth on, if you like. So on the last slide, and then we'll obviously pass over to Lottie and Emily, so you haven't got to listen to Chloe and I talk all morning at you, or afternoon, wherever you may be. So onto the next slide, if I can. So I know this isn't me at all, actually. I mean, I could talk a little bit about this, but I think I will pass over to Emily and Lottie on this, to talk about how the framework that Chloe and I have just mentioned and outlined, what does that mean for banking and financial institutions, and what do those complexities look like? Chloe, you've got your...
Yeah. You wanted to just mention, just on Russia very quickly, just before we pass over, you wanted to mention, and you've forgotten, Freya, the 17th package that's just come out, because I think there's been a lot of talk about what happens if the US lifts sanctions against Russia, what will EU operators do, what will UK corporates do, and how will that pan out? And I think what we discussed last night was there seems to still be a lot in that the EU can do, and we saw that in the 17th package. Sanctions do not appear to be going away for now, and I just wanted to make sure you touched on that before
Yeah, no, absolutely, and good point. So I'll do this super quick because I'm also mindful of time to make sure that Lottie and Emily get a chance to properly chat, and hopefully we get some questions in at the end. But yes, so we saw on Monday the launch of, or the release of, the EU 17th package on Russia sanctions, and interestingly, it was coordinated at the same time with the UK's designations that came out as well. We saw a number of designations by the EU, predominantly targeting Russia's shadow fleet. So there was a huge, focus there on maritime sanctions. A huge number of vessels being listed. And then we saw sort of a much more conservative approach taken by the UK with just, I think it was 18 vessels that were sanctioned. But it's really showing this shift in terms of looking at evasion and circumvention, which I think has been the highlight really for the last couple of EU packages. It's sort of shifting the fact that we've kind of exhausted, I would say, the types of sanctions that we can impose as a government in terms of what we're looking to kind of restrict. But we're then looking at different ways that is being evaded, different ways that illicit actors are sort of creating and building networks to try and circumvent those restrictions. So we're now starting to see this evolution of sanctions where we're sort of looking to plug holes, and in many ways it's almost like sort of a sinking ship, and you're trying to just kind of put a hand on each kind of like bit where the sort of water's spouting in from, because it will always move and it will always sort of still get in at some point. But looking at how governments are trying to kind of plug those gaps. There's also a conversation underway at the moment by both the EU and the UK, and I believe the US as well, in terms of what does the current OPC, the oil price cap, look like? Do we need to go beyond the $60 per barrel price? Do we need to actually lower that even further? It is actually sufficient at the moment. So that may well change in the coming weeks and months. So it's worth keeping an eye out on what that looks like. But definitely when you're looking at existing measures, they're not getting more complex, they're just getting a lot more widespread. So it's interesting to see where both the EU and UK's focus has been just this week. And interestingly, we didn't see the US come out with a similar adoption of measures. The US has obviously got quite extensive measures in place at the moment, certainly in respect of Russia, but you saw this sort of UK-EU coordination on Monday, and notably it was noticed by its absence that the US was not part of any new listings on that day, which obviously could signal that slight divergence now that we're seeing in terms of sort of political appetite in terms of how we move forward with Russia sanctions in particular. But no, thank you for the reminder on that, Chloe. I will happy to take questions at the end, of course, but I will pass over to both Emily and Lottie to go forward on the banking side of the house.
Great, thanks, Fer. So to start with, Emily and I are going to talk about what a good sanctions compliance framework looks like. So I think key to this is that the US sanctions regulator OFAC published its framework for compliance commitments in 2019, which provides its perspective on the essential components of a sanctions compliance program. So I think it's good to note that other jurisdictions like the UK haven't introduced such a framework, but this framework's widely viewed by organisations as best practice when looking to establish a sanctions compliance program. So whilst each sanctions compliance program will be risk-based and will vary depending on the variety of factors, including the bank's size, products, services, customers, geography, etc. Each program should be predicated on 5 essential components, which includes management commitment, risk assessment, internal controls, testing and auditing, and training. And I think why this is really key is that when considering apparent breaches of OFAC sanctions, OFAC favorably consider banks that had effective sanctions compliance programs at the time of the breach. So taking these points step by step, if we start with management commitment, so This includes points such as ensuring that senior management has reviewed and approved the organization's sanctions compliance program, that the compliance unit has sufficient authority and autonomy to deploy its policies and procedures, that senior management takes steps to ensure that the organization's compliant unit has adequate resources. So, for example, in the form of human capital. So good practice would be to have an OFAC sanctions compliance officer and ensure staff that have sufficient technical sanctions knowledge, and also good information technology in the form of software and systems and so on. And lastly, ensuring that senior management promote a culture of compliance throughout the organization. So, for example, whistleblowing and speak up channels, ability of personnel to report sanctions misconduct without fear of reprisal, and ensuring that senior management demonstrates that they understand the seriousness of violations of sanctions and take swift action to remediate issues as necessary. Then considering risk assessment, while there isn't a one-size-fits-all risk assessment, it's recognized that it should generally consist of a holistic review of the organization from top to bottom and assess its touch points to the outside world. So the risk assessment might look, for example, at customers, supply chain, intermediaries and counterparties, the products and services the bank offers, and the geographic location of the bank, as well as its customers, supply chain, intermediaries and counterparties. The risk assessment generally informs the extent of the due diligence efforts at various points in a relationship or in a transaction. So this could include, for example, onboarding. So good practice would be, for example, that a bank develops a sanctions risk rating for its customers as appropriate by leveraging information provided by the customer through the KYC process and independent research conducted by the bank at the initiation of the customer relationship. And this information then guides the timing and scope of future due diligence efforts. And then also importantly in mergers and acquisitions, so ensuring that the bank engages in appropriate due diligence to ensure that sanctions related issues are identified and addressed prior to the conclusion of any transaction and incorporated into the organization's risk assessment process. The risk assessment then feeds into the bank's internal controls. And so key good practices here are that the organization has designed and implemented written policies and procedures which clearly outline the sanctions compliance program, that the bank has implemented internal controls that address the results of its risk assessment, that the bank enforces its policies and procedures through internal or external audits, that the bank has record-keeping policies and procedures for which are adequate in line with OFAC sanctions, and that the organization ensures that upon learning of weaknesses in its controls, that it immediately and effectively resolves those and identifies the root cause. And lastly, that the bank has clearly communicated the policies and procedures to its staff and trained them on them. So I'll now pass you over to Emily to discuss the last points.
Oh, sorry, if we just go back. So sorry, I'll cover the last two. So testing and auditing, probably not one of the juiciest ones out of the five that we have listed there. But of course, auditing, it's not something that's unique to the financial sector, something across all sectors and companies. So I'll touch on it briefly, but auditing, of course, it's the assessment of your the effectiveness of your current processes and any inconsistencies that you have between these processes and your day-to-day operations. So it will look at your sanctions compliance program holistically. So it's going to include things like your software, your technology, your governance, your policy, your framework, looking across the whole program itself. And I think what's key about the OFAC document that Lottie clearly outlined is that there are three main considerations that are pulled out in that document. So first and foremost, it's that your audit function really does need to be independent of the activities that they're testing. They need to be accountable to senior management, and they should have the sufficient authority, skills, expertise, resource, etc., as required in order to perform their job and really make sure they're performing a meaningful review. And again, just as on the second point that OFAC draw out as part of making that meaningful, is that your auditing and your testing really does need to be appropriate to the level and sophistication of the sanctions compliance program that you have in place. So it really does perform a comprehensive and really objective assessment of the controls and the relevant risks to you as an organisation. And I think then just the third thing that OFAC pull out in their document is that whilst there's an acknowledgement that auditing and testing may find deficiencies or weaknesses as part of your program, and it may take some time to remediate against these, I think something that the document really stresses is that you still have to have immediate and effective action that you can take to identify and implement compensating controls whilst you're working on the root cause of that weakness, so you can sort of remediate the issue as a whole. So I think that's largely it on testing and auditing. And then the final point that you'll see on the slides is training. Again, I think this kind of links in quite nicely with auditing, in that training is a tool you could utilise with respect to audit findings and observations, just as part of your general action plans or any other sort of corrective action that you're taking. So it can be a reactive tool, but also I think you want to be using it as a proactive tool as well. So in order to do that, your training needs to be easily accessible to staff, and again, it really needs to be effective and meaningful. So to do this, it's probably going to require job-specific training. Again, sort of like Lottie pointed out, making sure that your sanctions compliance responsibilities are communicated effectively to your employees, and also holding your employees accountable for their sanctions training. So this could be through tests, assessments, that you tend to get at the end of your e-learnings, if that's something that your firm utilises. And so I think a key point that the OFAC guidance is really drawing out from this is that your training program, in order to be adequate, it needs to be tailored to your firm. So I think things to look at in terms of really tailoring your training are, first and foremost, the firm's risk profile. So this could be looking at, for example, the products and services that you offer. So, sticking with financial institutions, if you're a correspondent bank, you're a trade bank, you're a retail bank, whatever it may be, you're going to carry different risks associated with those products. So you should really be tailoring your training to account for those risks that you may potentially be exposed to. And then the other thing that you can look at, again, just in terms of your firm's risk profile, probably be your footprint and the geographic regions that you operate in. So, for example, if you're a trade bank and you have a lot of activity in the Middle East, then you might have a lot of exposure to Iranian goods, for example, saffron, carpets, whatever it may be. So that might be an area that you want to focus on and ensure your training covers. Or if you are a financial institution that engages in equities and you have presence in China or clients in China, you might want to look at the CMIC sanctions in particular. So you can really look at your products, your services, your geographical regions, and tailor the training to make sure that you're capturing the risk that is most appropriate to your firm. And then in terms of tailoring that training, again, once you've got that sort of broad basis of what you might be exposed to as a firm, it may be worth as well just drilling down into the target audience, relevant target audience, and your employees. So some employees may need more enhanced or further training compared to others. So again, sort of taking the CMIC example that we just used, if you're in equities in China, maybe your traders who are actually booking and executing trades, maybe they will need a different level of training to staff who are doing more administrative tasks. Or if you have staff who are largely involved in your customer due diligence and performing that, maybe you want to train them on a completely different area of sanctions. So look at your policy and look at how maybe you ring fence yourself from activity that you decide ultimately you're not comfortable with. And the steps you can take there. So I think that's key in drilling down to employees. It's really the role that they have, and again, the level of risk that is relevant to them. And something that is quite interesting in the OFAC document is that it also calls out training may be required for certain stakeholders. So, for example, even clients are included in that, which is quite interesting. And I guess that could be something as simple as looking at the products and services that you offer. And if you have, for example, US clients, maybe it's making them aware that you can't offer them certain services, or why you can't offer them certain services, for example. And then just the last point on training is, once you've established what you're training on, who you're training to, it's the question is probably how often you want to train, looking at the frequency of that training. So again, kind of the key point of this slide is that everything is going to differ from institution to institution, sort of depending on your risk profile. But I think general consensus from the document and industries is probably annual training is probably a minimum in terms of sanctions, and then maybe more regular, again, just dependent, like we said, on your risk, employees, but also in response to any regulatory developments, if that maybe shifts your policy position, or if it shifts the legal landscape, whatever it may be something you decide, actually, we're going to have to perform like an ad hoc out of cycle training in addition to our annual training. So I think that's my my last point really on the sanctions compliance framework.
Great, thanks, Emily. So Emily and I are now going to be looking at some of the key challenges with sanctions controls. So as it says on the slide, a key challenge is that screening is a very blunt tool. And I think it's interesting the way that the sanctions regimes have developed and how financial institutions are having to change their controls as a result. So traditionally, where the US has imposed country and territorial level embargoes, so for example, against Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and occupied Ukraine territory, as well as just imposing asset freezes and blocking prohibitions on targets, screenings worked really well to interdict all activity involving these countries, territories, and targets. For example, for countries, financial institutions can simply screen the countries, towns, regions, and ports of those countries. And then that allows them to reject or block or freeze the activity as appropriate. But really, as sanctions evolve, there are a number of challenges with sanctions screening. So I think, firstly, as sanctions evolve, sanctions programs are becoming more nuanced and not, against an entire country. So, for example, for Russia and Belarus sanctions, there's no country level embargo, for example, that the US has imposed against dealing with those countries. The US, UK, and EU and other sanctions are a lot more nuanced. So obviously, depending on a bank's risk appetite, just putting in blunt controls won't pick up the specific activity. It will just pick up all activity with that country. Secondly, screening works less well for trade sanctions, of which there's been a big focus in recent years. So, for example, thinking at detecting goods which might end up on the battlefield in Ukraine. Screening really doesn't work well to detect goods because there's no mandated requirement for someone in a transaction to list goods or describe them in payment messages. So payment messages typically won't describe goods. And as well, screening doesn't pick up sanctions evasion, for example, through high-risk third countries. And like I said previously, there's an increasing regulatory focus on detecting sanctions evasion, for example, in the context of goods ending up on the battlefields in Ukraine. So I guess in terms of ways that financial institutions could look to evolve their programs to pick those up, I think a key point is customer due diligence, particularly in the context of Russia. What a financial institution could do is, for example, review the ISIC codes to identify customers potentially operating in certain sectors of the Russian economy. I think a key control as we move forward as well is looking at proactive analysis. So this includes investigation as well as the use of analytics to identify or uncover characteristics which might indicate potential sanctions evasions typologies. So, for example, proactive analysis can be used where intelligence highlights macro-level evasion typologies or themes at a country or industry sector level. So, for example, we could look at unexplained increases in imports of white goods to Kazakhstan, for example. And you could also look at sources which identify third country suppliers. Look at sources which might identify third countries suppliers of items critical to Russian weapon systems. And I think lastly as well, a key point, as Emily mentioned earlier, is staff training, really. Regulators are increasingly introducing red flags documents with red flags that institutions should be aware of, for example, for Russian sanctions circumvention. And it's really key for staff in financial institutions to be aware of those red flags and how and when to escalate those to sanctions compliance. And then lastly, a key challenge is the speed of controls implementation. So it's not only having these new types of controls, but it's also making sure to implement them at speed. And as it says on the slide, what's especially difficult here is that sanctions don't have any kind of lead-in or consultation time. So controls really have to be very quick to react. And as it says on the slide as well, so jurisdictions like the UK and US operate on a strict liability basis. So this means that financial institutions can be held liable for sanctions violations, even if they didn't know or have any cause to suspect that they were violating the law. So simply what this could mean in the context of an asset freeze, for example, is if a financial institution has a customer which becomes sanctioned and that customer transacts on their account prior to a financial institution putting controls in place to prevent this, the financial institution could be held liable. And I think an interesting case from 2023 is, in a UK perspective, is where the UK financial sanctions regulator Ofsted issued a disclosure notice against Wise, where Ofsted had designated a Wise customer and an employee of the customer successfully withdrew £250 in cash using a debit card at a time when a sanctions alert had been generated but not fully investigated. And kind of key commentary in that disclosure notice is that Wise's policy at the time of the breach of not restricting debit cards when a possible name match to a designated person was identified was inappropriate in managing sanctions risk. And it also says a lack of staff availability to review sanctions alerts at the weekends also led to a material delay in the proper restrictions being placed on the sanctioned person's account and debit card. So there's really increased pressure on financial institutions to be introducing controls at speed. I will hand you over to Emily to discuss the next slide in terms of additional challenges in sanctions controls.
Thanks, Lottie. Yeah, so I think then this slide, we're really focusing, again, particularly on Russia, just because it's quite topical, but I think the points on this you could broadly apply to any sanctions program. It's just general challenges that we see in the sanctions control space. So I'll go through them in turn, but essentially the first one, trade sanctions, very closely interlinked to what Lottie was just articulating in the evasion and circumvention section. So again, really, yes, looking at goods, really difficult to, if you're a financial institution, really difficult to detect goods in a financial transaction, and it will very much depend on the product that you're looking at. You know, trade finance, for example, you're probably going to be more privy to goods being moved, but what's your role in that? You may have access to underlying documents in the trade, you may not, again depending on your role, the type of the trade that it is, etc. And sort of as Lottie was alluding to, recently, or actually probably a couple of years ago now, we had an increased focus from certain regulators really on those goods getting into the Ukrainian battlefield. And so it was specified items and common high priority goods that were really just dual use goods, and how they target that activity and stop those goods getting into Russia. And so regulators focused on something called HS codes, which are essentially a customs classification tool to kind of group and categorize goods. And this was really new and novel for banks, and it was really hard to implement that, because, as Lottie touched on, screening is such a blunt tool, and can't really use screening because you don't necessarily see HS codes. HS codes aren't mandatory in all documentation, so sometimes they don't even appear, depending on the jurisdiction that the goods are coming to and from. And then banks had to adopt a new novel approach. So really, I think discussions in industry and with regulators, it really involved a lot of translation exercises, taking these HS codes, translating against your internal bank systems, and maybe trying to come up with a list of customers that might be engaged with these HS coded products. Then looking at the jurisdictions that they operate. Do they export these products into Russia? Is this something that is a risk to us? What do we need to do? Starting client engagement, etc. So it really was sort of a challenge. And as Freya sort of touched on just in the beginning of this webinar, there does seem to be an increasing focus from regulators on looking to FIs to sort of be maybe the police officers of trade, even if they maybe aren't as knowledgeable as the importer and the exporter with respect to the underlying trade itself. And I think we've seen, again, touched on earlier, but the creation of OTSI, the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, really emphasises this point that it's clearly something that's on the UK regulator mind at least. And then in the OFAC side, we've seen a lot of focus generally on export controls and guidance from the Bureau of Industry and Security, for example, BIS. And then turning to the next point, we've got securities. So I think that's been a real challenge for banks as well, because traditionally sanctions, as they've evolved, they've become more complex. That's certainly something that we can say with surety, but they have traditionally always been quite focused and designed with cash in mind, and sort of looking at stopping those traditional cash flows. And even then, arguably, you run into problems with cash, because sometimes the regulations can treat cash as a proper physical property, bags of money, rather than an intangible banking product that's actually just something reflected on books and ledgers. But then when you try and take this and apply it to securities, it can be really difficult. And Chloe touched on earlier, we have seen certain sanctions regulations that are maybe more focused on translating these into the security space. So at the very outset of the Russia program, we did see regulations that targeted debt and equity sectors and looked at the issuance of debt and equities from a certain date and looking at the tenure and then trying to determine whether it was permissible or impermissible. But I think what we've seen lately is we've seen it ratchet up with the targeting of real key actors in the security space. The most recent being the back end of last year in relation to the National Settlement Depository, so the NSD. And this was essentially Russia's central securities depository that basically means it held and housed and sort of managed securities on behalf of third parties, investors, financial institutions, whatever it may be. And the designation that OFSI and OFAC in particular took, they designated and issued a broad read along with that designation. So any securities held at the NSD were caught regardless of the issuer, even if they were issued by a non-designated party. And I think what we saw at the back end of last year after that was almost like a game of counter-sanctions chess, because then you had President Putin passing a decree that moved the securities from the NSD to local registrars, effectively trying to take out that sanctions element. The NSD is the problem, let's remove them. OFAC were pretty quick to respond to say that's not quite how sanctions work. And so we are still considering considering these targeted securities. But that caused a lot of problems for banks. Again, the flow of information, one, is very difficult in Russia, but two, in the equity space, unless you're a local custodian, you may not even know where those local registrars were. So that created some issues, and I think then we had OFSI taking a less definitive position as well with regards to that transfer and whether it was illegal or not, and their guidance sort of focused more on ownership and control that we'll try and touch on the next couple of minutes. But I think it left banks scratching their heads and in a bit of a grey area, and I think sometimes the grey area in securities space does persist, and it was sort of touched on earlier, the divergence that we're getting, particularly between even Western regimes. So, for example, just looking at securities at a very broad level, high level, how they're traded. When you have a sanctioned party that issues a security, from an OFAC perspective, that product itself is blocked. So primary and secondary market activity is deemed impermissible. On the OFSI side, it's different. Secondary market activity is okay because the DP, the designated person interest, has been extinguished in the eyes of OFSI. So you've already got the divergence between regimes there. And then even within OFSI, for example, with secondary market, actually, if you're targeted under, for example, Regulation 16 of the Russian sanctions, then secondary market activity isn't okay. So you've got to navigate all these different things that are permissible and not permissible, and then somehow translate that into control. So that's quite difficult. And then the final point that I'm conscious of time, so I will rush through in 1 minute, which will absolutely not do the topic justice. This could be a webinar in its own right, but ownership and control. So essentially, I mean, the language is nuanced. It's either 50% or more than 50%. But if you're looking broadly around the 50% mark, if you're 50% owned by a sanctioned party, you yourself are considered subject to sanctions under both OFAC and OFSI. And so the problem with this, again, translating into a control perspective, you're not actually listed. You may not be named on a list. So it's very much a case of maybe trying to maintain internal lists, maybe looking at an external vendor who can provide an enhanced list, maybe looking at your client due diligence. If you have a client, hopefully you will have worked through and done your due diligence and identified the ultimate beneficial owner, so you know that they're not sanctioned. But again, if you're just looking at a payment and you're just involved in a payment and actually the end counterparty is not your client, you won't be privy to that information. And in certain jurisdictions, like Russia, it's extremely hard to, the information is not very transparent at all. In fact, President Putin, again, as part of this sort of political chess, has made that deliberately so, that it is hard to determine the beneficial owners in Russian companies, to determine if they're subject to sanctions. So it's really about sort of how banks unweave this web. And then ownership is one thing, and then you go into control, and it's a whole other minefield, so particularly relevant to the UK. And I think there's been a lot of activity in the control space, and we've even seen the judiciary and the executive, quite frankly, just outright disagreeing with each other, particularly at the onset of the judicial cases that we were seeing. So, I mean, if you're interested in looking at this, this all sort of kicked off in the Mints and NBT and Bankocracy case, where the judge, as part of his obiter comments, stated that Putin was the apex of a command economy, and as such, he could be deemed to control everything in Russia. And I think this sent companies into a flurry of panic, that every company in Russia could potentially be sanctioned. And we have moved away from that very broad application of the law. There's been subsequent case law, like Litasco, the Hellard case, etc. And we've sort of come to a point where there are maybe now four types of control. De jure, which is actually the legal rights under which you can exercise control. De facto, exercising a decisive influence over the entity. And then potential de jure, which means you can obtain ownership or control in the future and have the legal means to do so, or potential de facto, which is that the designated person could otherwise exercise control if they wish to. So I think we've moved away from that. The regulations are particularly tricky to apply to practical examples, but I think we're still seeing this as something that's quite complex for financial institutions. So I will stop talking now and let Lottie wrap this up.
Thanks, Emily. Just conscious of time, so I'll go quickly. And I think what lies ahead is an interesting question. It's very difficult to make any predictions on what lies ahead because, as has been discussed, the geopolitical landscape is so unstable. I guess to summarize, the key points of key political uncertainty at the moment are with regards to the Russia sanctions, and any potential lifting of Russia sanctions will really depend on any ceasefire, which so far Putin hasn't put in place, and the UK and EU in fact introduced new Russia sanctions this week. And with the Syria sanctions, it will be really interesting to see what the dismantling of those sanctions look like, and it will be very complex for financial institutions in terms of how those sanctions might diverge and making sure to comply with all of the regimes. And again, just as sanctions evolve and become more complex, banks need to think of new controls to comply with all of these multi-jurisdictional regimes. And there's lots of complex issues that we discussed, particularly with regards to detection of sanctions evasion. And on top of this, financial institutions need to ensure that they implement controls at speed. So it's becoming increasingly challenging. So thank you. I'll hand you over to Aspen.
Thank you all so much. That brings us to the end of today's session. I appreciate all of the incredible speakers, Chloe, Lotte, Emily, and Freya, for generously sharing their insights and experiences. We've covered a lot of ground today, from global sanctions trends and operational impacts on financial institutions to best practices for screening and compliance. But one thing I think is very clear is that effective sanctions controls are not just regulatory requirements, they're frontline safeguards in an increasingly complex global landscape. And as a thank you for attending today's webinar, GCI is offering an exclusive 15% discount on all of our self-study programs, valid for the next 30 days. You will receive this with your certificate of attendance via email post the webinar. This is a wonderful opportunity to invest in your professional development. Details on how to redeem this will be sent in a follow-up email, as I mentioned. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at info@gci-ccm.org. And thank you again for being a part of this important conversation, and have a wonderful rest of your day.